this is a difference between computers and the brain. Bigger physically.
Oh,
it's growing.
Physically
it's
growing.
physically growing. I'm physically creating new neurons.
Firing, does that mean you can also like fire electrical signals and control the human body? Oh my
These
goodness.
are all very specific things that you don't think about that you do.
Yeah.
And that's why whenever...
Sonya Ashikyan, a bachelor's in artificial intelligence and neuroscience? What is your actual degree in?
Cognitive science.
In cognitive science. That's a very...
Just cognitive science.
Just cognitive science.
But cognitive science includes artificial intelligence, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, anthropology, which is the study of evolution, and many things.
Wow.
Statistics. So it's like 9 different studies. It's interdisciplinary, which the point of it was actually to bring together all of these different views to understand how does a computer think and how does a human think and how similar are they.
So what does cognitive science contribute to like the average human being? What kind of help and what kind of benefit do you feel like is the main goal of having cognitive science?
So cognitive science, in a lot of people who are cognitive scientists, they might go into the artificial intelligence path, which are people who go and work on robots, for example, and how a robot might function or how AI might respond and try to mimic it to how a human responds, because you know how a human responds. The other path is kind of what I do, which is neuroscience, going on the more human path, understanding more on how humans think. And based on that, which my belief is we don't know nearly enough about the brain to be translating it to humans. So we should start learning more about the brain, which is what we have, and then we can make more accurate robots, which is why I took the neuroscience path.
That's very cool. So after you're finishing your bachelor's, you decided, you know what, like we don't know anything about humans in general. Why are we trying to replicate them? We should dive deeper into that. So is that what your cognitive neuroscience master's degree was all about?
Yeah, the master's degree was more about the theories and how can we study this. And now that I'm in my PhD, that's more about how can we create new knowledge. So when you do the master's, you realize it's a lot of information, it's difficult, but it's not as much as you think that we know. A lot of people have the misconception of like, we have the technological advancement to, have a pill that's a chip that'll go into your brain and do all these things and control you and read your mind. We are not nearly that advanced in science.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not at all. We do have things which, for example, when we look at research that is done in Stanford or Berkeley, I don't remember, where they're able to put an EEG device, and an EEG device is something when it's on you, you will know. It can't be like a chip. It's all of these electrodes that are on your head, and it's going to monitor your brain activity, and based on that brain activity, they were able to map out what a person was seeing when they were watching a movie. So kind of like an image. The image wasn't very clear, but regardless, it was still a big step forward. But again, that you would know if someone's doing that to you. And it's not very clear of an image. You kind of knew what the image was because you have the original video. You knew what the person was looking at. So if they're looking at a flower, you know it's a flower. But if you looked at it without that, you can't really tell. So it's not that good. And then on the other hand, there are kind of like chips which they can place in the brain that'll constantly monitor activity. They do this a lot with patients who are having problems with sleep. And that kind of activity will tell them not necessarily what you're thinking, because we don't really have a way to accurately map out your thoughts.
Okay.
So every single thing that you're thinking, we can't really accurately know what it is you're thinking. More recently, they created like an AI generative model that's trying to look at how a neuron is firing and what the words could be that are in your thoughts, but it's not incredibly accurate. But again, they would need to do an invasive surgery. So you would know that they put the chip in your brain.
Sounds like some dystopian surgery times.
Yeah.
Does not sound very nice. But I guess surgery in general is scary either way. That's actually very cool. I was reading about the Stanford studies on what they're doing with their neural imaging. But before we get to Stanford, I kind of want to talk more about you. What led you to be a cognitive neuroscientist? Why did you go into cognition in the first place?
I found, the first time when I heard about psychology, I thought it was great. There was all these theories, But then when I heard about the neuroscience aspect, I just thought, well, isn't it more important to know, why does it matter that we know what the brain looks like and what the name of all these structures are if we don't know what they do? And how is it that you can have a thought in your mind, but there's no voice, but you're creating this voice and you're hearing it and you're having all these internal things happening, but you're not able to, how is that created? Through just an electrical impulse in your brain to a thought or an emotion.
That is pretty crazy, yeah.
That is something very advanced that we don't yet know. And then I found out that the study of that is called cognitive neuroscience, and it's only been around for about 10 years. So it's very new.
Yeah, that is brand new.
And
newer than AI. So.
Yeah, and it's so new. It's because we only recently had the technology to be able to study that, and it's not very common in many places. Not even all the universities in America have that. Very few do.
Wow.
So I really wanted to know that relationship. How is this electrical impulse or this neuron going from just a little neuron to everything that you are? All of your memories, all of your thoughts, all the complex things that you could do. How is that possible? We don't yet really know, but we are getting closer and closer.
That's exciting stuff.
I agree.
Yeah.
Kind of biased, but I agree.
I mean, I'm a little biased too because technology is like number one in my heart. But yeah, I don't think the world's going anywhere unless we have that kind of field of study and these kinds of people looking into it.
Yeah, and in terms of cognitive science specifically, 5 years ago, which now that I think about it's past some time, when I decided to major in cognitive science for my bachelor's degree, I had a feeling that it was going to be something that was going to be the future.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially that the study of computers was going to be a big thing. And that was a new major at the time, and it was one of the smallest majors at UCLA. And there was not many people interested in it. It was just so many random things, nobody wanted to do it. Now I'm an associate instructor at UCLA and I'm teaching in the same department, and I could see that there's so many more students in cognitive science because of AI growing, and people realizing that if they have a degree in cognitive science, they're very likely to get a job. Because if they can't find a job with computers, they could find a job in philosophy or psychology or neuroscience.
Or teaching
and so,
computers.
Yeah, or teaching. And so there's so many different doors that will open, and that's kind of why I went into it, because I predicted that this will become a bigger thing, and it has.
That's some awesome stuff.
And this is before ChatGPT became like a big thing.
Yeah, before they announced GPT-3.
Yes, exactly.
That's a crazy time. How do you think that actually affected your schoolwork? Like, how do you think having ChatGPT-3 would have affected your decision in going into this field?
I think it would have made me more certain that it was going to be a big thing if I had seen that at that time that ChatGPT was going to be such an impact, and now AI is literally everywhere that I look. Mm-hmm. At that time, it wasn't. The bad thing of that, though, now that I'm teaching, I have caught people using ChatGPT on assignments, and we have seen like a very deep slope of students not really learning as much because they're relying more on artificial intelligence. So that's kind of the big problem. We're seeing a decline, and UCLA is very selective. So that's
like
really
the best of LA,
yeah, that's a concern. These are the highly selected people that are really smart, but they're kind of losing a lot of their, unique capabilities because of that.
That's a little scary. That actually brings up a great point. In 2024, the number one word, according to our Oxford University's word of the year, was brain rot. What does that mean to you?
I think usually that might mean that you're kind of, people seek social media or AI to kind of relieve the cognitive load or the pressure on their brain from thinking so much. And so that might be the case as to why people use that word so much, or kind of created a word for that, because it became more and more common of an experience throughout your day, which before it really wasn't. Even if you wanted to relax, you probably weren't scrolling on TikTok before it was a thing. You were probably doing something else. Maybe you were like reading a book. Yeah. Now that's becoming less and less common. And so that's kind of what that means to me. People constantly searching in ways to do less and less with their own energy for their brain.
I see. So with the growth of AI, right, it comes the kind of growth of our ability to think and to grow our skill set, or to like pretend that we have a skill set that we never had before. Do you think that is going to lead to our brain shrinking? Is that how that works? 'Cause
Brain shrinking is actually just a sign of aging. So everybody's brain shrinks as they age. And you'll see more brain shrinking, so smaller brains, people who have neurodegenerative disease such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, those are like very major big steps of worse shrinkage. What I study in brain injuries, even if you're a person who's younger, so a lot of people like from 18 to 25 years old, if they're in a sport, American football, the real football, or military personnel, they're typically young, about 25 years old. If you get brain injuries, you'll have brain shrinkage from that too. I don't think there has been any studies found that will cause brain shrinkage, but it might cause the faster aging throughout your lifetime, so shrinkage happening sooner.
To your brain?
Yes, that might be the case, because that is somewhat of what studies are finding with marijuana use, for example, meaning that it's possible with experiences in your life and things that you do.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I would have guessed marijuana because I feel like it makes people, like, forces them to be slower, so.
Yeah, pretty much. It essentially just slows down the entire nervous system. That's what it's doing. And if you constantly use it, like every day per se, or like multiple times a week, that has also been found to just overall make your brain function slower, even when you're not using the marijuana.
Oh, okay. I thought you were talking about AI for a second there. I was like, well, that's.
Oh.
I've been doing it daily for a while now.
No.
Do you know actually 5% of the entire world's population uses ChatGPT weekly?
That would make sense. I would kind of expect more.
Over 400 million weekly users. I thought that was insane.
I don't typically use it. I probably use it once just because I want to see how it worked. I do think it's a good tool to kind of like give you an outline. But I feel like if I was to even use it as a tool in an outline constantly, then I would use the capability of me to produce ideas on my own. And that's the hard part.
Yeah.
And I feel that the more time that it goes on, that AI's existence and how it's related to literally everything in our lives, the more people are constantly going to rely on it. And then the very few people who don't rely on it are going to still have those skills to initiate creative thoughts. And we're just going to see a bigger and bigger difference in like IQ and thinking. Yeah, so that is kind of the concern. We do have meetings. When AI first, like ChatGPT first came out, a bunch of neuroscientists and psychologists had a meeting, and we went in and everybody was very stressed out. And they thought, people are thinking that the brain isn't so important now because everyone's thinking that AI is so much smarter. And so a bunch of work started coming out of UCLA, giving the same task and the same questions to AI and to undergraduate UCLA students, and trying to see which one's more accurate. And you can see
the UCLA students.
So it depends on what it is that the question is. So if it's something, there's different types of knowledge and different types of memories. So the memory of, per se, things that are just a fact. Who was the first president of the United States? Maybe I never heard of that, or maybe I forgot.
Yeah, that more important things to think about.
Yeah, that is something that is very common in humans. We're not very good at that unless it's something emotionally important to you, you'll remember it. But AI doesn't have the emotional difference. It's actually very good at remembering that information because it's not remembering. It just has it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like it has a book open.
It goes
just
to a drawer,
look at it and I know what it is, whereas I can't really do that. Even if I have who the first president is in my mind and I might remember it later, I can't actively retrieve all of the information in my brain. So even if I have it in my brain, doesn't mean I have access to it, which a lot of people don't really know about that.
I'm sorry, hold on. I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're telling me I know things, but I can't remember the things that I know?
Yes.
How?
So that is kind of the idea of cognition, right? Cognition is your thoughts, your emotions, things that your brain does that I cannot see, but you experience it.
Like actively.
Right. So let's say I'm having a thought, and for example, imagine it this way, because I'm trying to keep it simple.
I appreciate it.
In your brain, there's a bunch of drawers, and in those drawers, some of them have locks on it. And you don't have all the keys. You kind of lost the key to some of them.
Why did I put the keys away?
You kind of lost them. You don't know where they are. You just got lost in your other thoughts. And then let's say you got asked who's the first president of the United States. And then I think, okay, well, I know where that drawer is. Let me go open it. Oh, well, I lost the key. I don't know what it is. But I feel like I know I have it. I know it's in this drawer. I can't remember it.
Oh.
Well, I say I don't know, but I feel like I remember learning it.
You'll eventually
Right.
find the key.
So then eventually I'm thinking that someone's like, oh, isn't it George? And then you're like, then you might, well, I forgot who the first one, George Washington.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, George Washington.
There you go. You unlock the door.
And that's that key, George. I take the key, I open it, I'm like, Washington. But nobody said Washington to me.
Yeah.
They said George.
Yeah, that's
Nobody gave me that. Exactly. I remember George
That
Washington.
happens all the time.
Exactly. So that means George Washington's name for who's the first president was in my brain, but I didn't have access to it.
Wow.
I needed some sort of help or some sort of something to help me, or I needed some time so that I can have access to it. And your brain actually has lots of information. It's just typically this information that gets locked in these drawers and you forget the key. In your brain might start deleting that information if it sees that you're not going to open that drawer. It says, what's the point? If I'm trying to learn how to play a guitar, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm not remembering the presidents don't really matter anymore. I haven't used it in 10 years. Let me delete that information and put the guitar information in there instead.
Mm-hmm.
So it's essentially a very efficient network, and that's how it works. So it's pretty cool.
That sounds insanely cool.
Yeah.
And your analogy was fantastic, but there was so many words. I think I lost
Oh.
the drawer I was putting these into. So, you know a lot. That's really
Right.
cool.
Thank you.
Does that mean you have bigger drawers because you've been working on your filing cabinet?
So your brain is this is a difference between computers and the brain. This is a very big difference. For example, I can delete information, I could delete neurons, and I could add new information in that place.
Okay.
So instead of George Washington, I now have had to play guitar in that same place. But let's say I start to play the guitar for 20 years because I love playing the guitar.
Okay.
I play the guitar so much, and I'm using my right hand to play. I don't know how to play actually. But then, because I'm using my right hand and I have all this guitar knowledge that I didn't before, my right hand is going to grow.
Okay.
My right hand part of the brain. So, which is actually on the left side. So this part is growing bigger and bigger physically.
Oh,
It's
physically
it's
growing.
physically growing. I'm physically creating new neurons. And the neurons that exist in that part of my brain are actually creating new branches. So that one neuron is creating more branches.
Oh my god, this makes AI look like a joke.
Exactly. And so the computer doesn't have the capability to rewire itself, to take out a wire. It doesn't have the capability to add a new wire. It doesn't have the capability to do all these things. It's only doing whatever a person has programmed into it. It's only capable of using the wires that a person has already installed. This is a main difference. I'm not even thinking in my mind, okay, actively delete this part of my brain, I don't need it. It's doing it on its own. We're not conscious of that.
Yeah.
That's also a very big thing. Most of what the brain does, you're not aware that it's doing it, and it's doing it on its own. And that's very interesting because another thing that people don't know is that no two brains are the same. When you Google a picture of the brain,
Mhm.
they all look the same.
They
No
do.
two brains are the same.
Is it like
In
the
fact,
waves are different?
they're physically different.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, on a study of soccer players, they see that their feet are much larger in their brain. They're part of the brain that control the feet, and the information that they get from their feet are much bigger than a regular person.
So, like, you can have a lopsided brain that looks like
Exactly.
a sand beach or beach
Yeah,
sand?
a lot bigger. And so, again, this is, computers can't do that type of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And even, not only is it physically different in its shape, it's also different in where the neurons fire and where the blood goes. So this means that it's functioning differently and it's physically different.
Okay. So
Every single person.
that's pretty amazing. So how would you recommend, like let's say I want to learn how to play the guitar. I suck completely. I've been trying for like a year and a half. How do I improve my brain's ability? Like, how do I grow my hand brain so that I can strum without having to look straight down and pick it very slowly?
It's honestly just practice, and there are ways that you could practice that make it better. So like repetition over time and like random time. So let's say I do it once a day, and then maybe I do it today, and then I do it 2 days later, So you need to constantly work on it, and the older you get, the more you need to work on it to get a little bit of effort, and that's just called plasticity, changing to learn.
You gotta
The
learn
younger
right
you
now.
are, it's easier to learn. So, for example, little kids, they're actually born with more neurons than an adult, but those neurons don't have any connections. And that's why they learn so well. Because when they're very little, they can hear 3 languages. They're not talking. They're these little kids that don't seem to know how anything works.
Just like bite on
and then
your fingers.
eventually, after 3 years, they learn 3 languages after they knew literally how nothing worked. And that's because those little neurons start to delete itself that they're not using. And the ones that already existed start to create a bunch of branches and connect with each other. And that is plasticity. So older you get, the slower plasticity is, but it's always there. And that's how the brain essentially works.
That is incredible. So whenever like babies just randomly seem to be able to like talk and like control themselves at like 3 years old or something, is that when like the useless neurons get deleted? Is that why they're like kind of blankly staring into space one day and then asking you questions until you like can't hear them anymore the next?
Well, yeah, they're kind of removed over time, essentially, while I'm keeping it simple. Of course, there is more, but that is basically the premise of conceptually how the brain works and how it does things. And it's always doing things at maximal efficiency. So people don't necessarily give it the credit that it is. It's actually incredible. The speed that a neuron fires is super fast. Any
Literally
computer that is
speed,
created now is nowhere near the efficiency and the capability that the human brain has. And for example, the example that I was saying that no 2 brains are the same physically, we'll look at a computer. If I have a MacBook Pro, all the MacBook Pros are made exactly the same. This is not the case in humans. Even when you're born, you have genetic differences. So you're born predestined to be able to learn something better than someone else.
Yeah.
So even
you got an unfair
just
advantage, yeah.
from that, you're different. Whereas again, the computer does not have that.
Some impressive stuff. The brain is really cool.
Yes.
So what I just learned is that AI is literally trying to mimic the brain, as we learned from episode 1. That's the whole point of it. You know, they got their neurons, their artificial neurons, which try and make a very simple. Wow, I should have talked to you before we made that episode. Everything makes so much more sense now.
Yes. So, I think there's a lot of questions regarding. I think we're jumping too quickly into AI without realizing what it is that we have ourselves.
Yeah.
And the computer does work a lot like the brain. So, for example, instead of a neuron, you have a wire, and actually they're kind of the same thing the way that they work. There's wires that actually take literal electricity, which is what your brain does, and then around the wire there's like a little plastic tube that covers it to keep it safe.
Yeah, you got insulation.
Yeah, right, and that also doesn't let the electricity flow out. Your brain has the exact same thing. There's like a little fatty
it's like
tissue
controlled little
covering it.
challenges.
Exactly.
Wow.
And that makes it faster. So it's essentially the same, the way that it's created.
So the brain is just a really messy computer with wires going through everywhere and
Very
a million different
complicated.
processors.
Yeah, but the parts of the brain that, it's not as simple that, the back of the brain does vision and the front does decision making.
That's what I've been saying all my life.
Which is correct, but it's not that simple. For example, there's a specific part of the brain that for many years, it's called the fusiform face area. It's called that because they thought it's your part of the brain that is able to recognize faces. So when I see someone and I recognize it's you, I'm using my fusiform face area.
So fusiform face area?
Yeah, fusiform face area.
So fuse a form, like an image.
Fusiform. It's one word.
Fusiform. Okay.
Yeah. And for a long time, this was thought, this is the part of the brain that recognizes faces. Because they put someone in an fMRI, and fMRI is just looking at where the blood is in, like where are the neurons firing, essentially. And they showed a bunch of people faces, and it might be people that you don't know and people that you do know, and they wanted to see, and every single time, this little tiny spot was always working.
Okay.
And they thought, this is the face area. All the neuroscience made it the fusiform face area. But then they realized, wait, it seems to be a little more complicated, because one neuroscientist brought in a race car driver and started to show him cars, and the fusiform face area started to light up. So this kind of disproved that, because that's not a face at all. So it got disproved. It's still the name, but it's disproved that it's not faces. It's actually the part of the brain that's responsible for things that you can distinguish very well. For example, if I study birds, if I see a bird, it'll light up.
Okay.
So every single part of the brain is extremely specific to what you want to do. And yeah. And so, for example, when we talk about, a lot of people ask, does AI have thoughts? And do they perceive these things in the same way that we do?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in my perception, there's different beliefs on this. Maybe eventually they do have thoughts, and maybe they do have consciousness, maybe by some definition. But I don't think it would be the same as a human. Because, for example, when I'm that race car driver and I see a car, I see all of my memories that I was in that car, all of my memories, maybe I had a crash, I remember that. Then I have an emotional response to that. Whereas if I'm an AI, I see a car, I have a definition and all the specs of that car.
Yeah.
It's not the same experience.
There's no connections between,
Yeah, so I feel like the human would be different and the AI would have a different experience. It's still an experience nonetheless.
Really?
But it's not that advanced yet, and maybe if it is, it's not going to be the same as a person.
So I was actually using ChatGPT as the deeper learning or deep researcher finally available to not the $200 a month subscriber people. Super excited. It literally happened like this week, I think. It says whenever I tried to search you up, I was like, hey, I'm interviewing Sonya Ashikyan. She works at UCLA. Please give me some information about her work.
I wish I did that. I wanted to know what it would say.
It is kind of cool.
Okay.
But what they say is that it does a research project essentially. It took like 7 or 8 units to finish. And in the side, it's telling you what it's doing. On the side, it told me it's like, oh, I'm searching Bing. Apparently, it uses Bing.
Okay.
Thought it would use.
That's kind of weird.
It is. It's an interesting browser choice. But it uses Bing, and it's like, I'm searching Sonya Ashikyan with UCLA tagged to it. I was like, that makes sense, sure. But then it didn't bring up like your actual research papers and what was relative to it, because that's what I asked for. I'm like, what research does she do? What can I like think? What should I know about before talking to her? And it went through a series of steps, but it was obviously not a human thinking about it. There was no like, there's relations to those steps, but it was like the most basic relations to the steps. So it was asking itself like, oh, well, now that I know where this person works, I'm going to figure out what their like work area is. And so it looked at all of UCLA. I'm like, pause, dude, you're completely off track here. But at the end, it got back to what you kind of do, and it found the name of your lab. I was like, that's kind of cool. That's one step, you know. So now I know where to go and research. But I was expecting it more to kind of give me the answer I was looking for.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is, so Alan Turing, who's kind of the father of computer science.
The Turing test.
Exactly, the Turing test, which is what I was going to bring up. He thought that if people, and this is what the Turing test is, if you're able to talk, have a chat with an AI, and the AI is going to convince you that they're human. So you're talking to multiple people at the same time, essentially. And some are AI and some are human in the Turing test.
Oh, okay.
And Alan Turing believes that if a bunch of people are not able to distinguish whether you're AI and human actually think you're a human, then they have human thoughts. And that's what he thought. He believed that AI and human can have similar thoughts.
Oh, the artificial general intelligence. That was the
goal. That was his belief. And of course now some people can talk to AI and think that it's like totally legitimate.
Yeah, if you're like really dumb. No offense to her.
Well, so technically, current AI does pass the Turing test, but Alan Turing again is a computer scientist. He doesn't have an understanding of the brain, not in an offensive way, but he's missing
that's not a specialty.
Big chunk of information to compare.
Is he alive?
I believe he passed away.
Yeah, he would be like
not sure.
112 or something.
But anyway, then a psychologist. He came out and said, I disagree. I don't think that even if they pass the Turing test, that is proof that they have thoughts. And what he created is the Chinese room experiment, which in this case, he's saying, I'm a person, I don't speak Chinese at all.
Okay.
And Chinese is in characters, not in like letters, the way that English is. And he's in this room, and there's nothing in it. And people who do speak Chinese, they put in Chinese written like questions. And then they put it in there, in his room, without seeing him, and he'll just look and match the characters in this definition book and find a response and say something back. And in his example, he's saying, I just responded, the person got an answer in Chinese, and the person outside who speaks Chinese thinks that the person inside also speaks Chinese because they got a right answer.
That's exactly.
But does he speak Chinese? He's like, no, I don't know how to speak Chinese. I literally just opened the definition and I looked for it. And that was kind of him saying that even if you pass a Turing test, doesn't mean that it thinks like a human. And I do kind of agree with that type of thinking in the Chinese room experiment. Does AI really understand what a rose is? Maybe it just has a definition that it's a flower. But does it have the same experience as you as to what it smells like and what memories that it evokes and what that is? Not necessarily. Does it prove that it knows what a rose is? Not really sure. What is really knowing? Kind of gray area there. But again, kind of not the same as a human.
I see exactly what you mean. When I was trying to research like the history and everything of it, I learned like what AI is specifically doing, what ChatGPT is, what these generative pre-trained transformers are doing. They literally take exactly what you just said with that Chinese room test. They just look at your answer, they match it with stuff it's seen before with this pre-trained data, and then it's like, well, this is something I could say or I could show. So yeah, it's literally just showing characters. It has no idea what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. So I do kind of agree with the psychologist on that type of thinking. Although Alan Turing has done incredible things, like one of the biggest inventions at this time
pretty awesome.
of computer science, but kind of lacking on how the human brain works in order to compare.
I mean, back in the 1970s with like that ELISA bot that I mentioned in the previous episode, it's sometimes fooled people into thinking it was a person just because it was responding with predetermined like text. It doesn't mean the bot was actually like speaking. It was just like, you know. So that's a great point to make by a psychologist.
Yeah, and I think neuroscientists have a little bit of a different approach where psychologists typically take the theory kind of route, whereas neuroscientists kind of say, like, look at how the brain is functioning and compare that to how a computer is functioning. I kind of have the understanding of both a little bit, and I even use AI in my work when I do research, which is primarily on traumatic brain injuries. And that is, some people are afraid of that because we don't know too much of AI, and to kind of bring it into the medical field and in research, that's kind of like scary for some people. But given you just use it as a tool and you only use safer AI, not all AI is generative and predictive. And so that's something to think about as well.
Use machine learning to look at your data and sort through it.
Yeah. And so, and also just like all types of methods, there are limitations of it. Not every single study that we use without AI is fully known how it works. We just kind of, sometimes you're shooting in the dark.
I mean, that's what science is.
But
you just gotta shoot until you hit it.
But, that's kind of the idea. We don't know how stuff works. So, yeah.
That's awesome. What kind of AI model do you use for work?
Well, I am using a predictive model to create some sort of tool for physicians to use whenever a traumatic brain injury patient, in a mild case, it's a concussion, comes in, and
in a mild case, it's a concussion?
Yeah. A concussion.
The extreme case.
The extreme case is somebody who probably gets into a very severe car accident, then gets into a coma, and then they have to remove parts of the brain. Which is, I also study that type of severe case.
That's intense.
But that's another story.
Okay.
In the concussion
case,
keep
it simple.
Keeping it simple. In the concussion case, we want to see, are we able to predict what cognitive impairments, right, their thoughts and their emotions, are these people going to have 6 months or 3 months after the injury. So let's say somebody comes in, I take their MRI, I put it into this predictive model, and it says, well, I looked at a bunch of people who had similar impairments and a similar brain change, and this is what I think you're going to have memory loss, and I'm 90% confident in that. And 3 months from now, you're going to still have memory loss. And so the physician will say, okay, well, maybe I should keep following up with this patient, because typically right now, the standard treatment would be that that patient just goes home regardless, and they get no treatment, no medication, no follow-up, nothing.
Well, they just let them be.
They just let them leave. But we're finding that that's not necessarily the
That's not very healthy, yeah.
But again, socially even, concussions are not taken very seriously. Like if you watch UFC, in one fight, there's probably 10 concussions.
Oh yeah, every night there's at least like 3.
Right, so there's just, it's so common that people don't really take it seriously, but we're finding that it should not be taken so lightly.
So that's a great point to mention. Like, there's people getting concussions like at least like 9 times, like I don't know, in like a decade. How does that affect their brain?
It does cause shrinkage. If you have concussions, which is the mild case I was talking about, and again, that's like military personnel or athletes, they typically have this. It's going to cause things like Alzheimer's to occur, especially early on, so when you're younger. For example, Muhammad Ali, he experienced that. Any sort of major athlete experiences that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of American football players experience that, where their brain physically shrinks. That's also why they have problems with managing their emotions, so it causes like aggression, personality change sometimes, and these are major problems. And of course, they can be prevented. What we've also found is American football players' helmets are actually not effective in preventing brain injuries. So they reduce it a little bit, but they don't reduce the type of injury that is like 90% of the injury. They just kind of suppress the 10%. So it's not very effective.
Someone used to talk to me about that.
Right.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, so let's say I don't have a brain injury. My brain's okay. And I am just a man who is now quadriplegic because I was taking out my trash and I don't know, I fell and then now all my muscles are gone. I heard that there are computer brain interface device thingies. And so I think this is actually related to the Stanford studies you were talking about. But they gave a man who's quadriplegic the ability to write letters using machine learning. And I thought that was the craziest thing of all time and definitely the best use of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I have to agree.
Yeah.
There is similar work that is done where they take amputees and they add a robotic arm, for example, for a person who's lost the arm, and through the brain, they're able to mimic what the person wants to do in terms of arm movement, and with their thoughts, they can control the arm as if it was their own. But that's very, very expensive, and very few people have.
That sounds awesome. So yeah, these are very interesting methods of applying kind of artificial intelligence that learned about your brain patterns, I guess. I don't fully understand how that works. The article I was reading was very broad, and it was like, hey, we're doing this, we're awesome people. But apparently they were using machine learning in order to recognize what electricity was going on through the brain for whenever the guy was imagining to write a letter. And they just wrote that letter in his head so many times that eventually the algorithm was able to recognize, hey, when these neurons fire, he's doing this. That sounds really cool, but you mentioned that all brains are different. So
yes.
Does that mean that this research has absolutely nothing to do with the next patient, or would they be able to at least use a little bit?
Well, they would have to, that type of work, when you have to find a very specific part of the brain that does a function, you would have to look for what part of the brain that is. So, since every brain is different, you would take an MRI, and then you would kind of map on where on average that part of the brain would be. And then you could take a TMS, which is a transcranial magnetic stimulation, and then you can add a shock to it as if, for sure, I'm going to artificially make that part of the brain fire. And then if you are right that that's controlling the hand, then the hand would move. That's kind of the idea. The brain is organized in different parts that have specific functions. Again, like it's very specific. So the part that does your hand is roughly in the same place for everybody, but not exactly in the same place.
I see.
It might be bigger or smaller depending on who it is and
how
what
much
they've done in their
play.
life. Yeah, or how much soccer they would.
Yeah. So this is a little bit of a dystopian idea, right? But because they're able to put this little chip in this man's brain, this brain-computer interface, this BCI, and they're able to recognize the electrical signals firing, does that mean they can also fire electrical signals and control the human body?
So all of those things that we talked about before, they're all reading activity, not making new activity. To make new activity, you need to be able to create an electrical impulse elsewhere, and every single device that we have that does that is either a device that's this big, which is weak stimulation, or one that is extremely large, nowhere near big enough to put that in your brain, because it's a big process.
It's a lot of power, huh?
Yeah, and the brain is able to fire these electrical impulses through chemicals changing and like physics of chemicals entering and exiting the neuron, and like the negative impulses are causing it to fire. So all of this is very, you know, we can't really do that with a computer.
That's very relaxing for me.
But the hand thing, it's a big step, but it's not the same as like being able to read one's thoughts. And it's not the same as how advanced as we think it is, because when you get to this point, once I know what part of the brain does the arm for that person, there's a neuron connected to each muscle, and if I make that neuron fire, there's a neuron connected to each. There's a neuron connected to each muscle. If I make that neuron fire, then it's going to make that muscle move, and that muscle movement is going to make my arm move.
Ooh.
So it's not as complex as cognitive processes are, because that's a motor process.
That makes sense. Yeah, because there's physical reactions.
Yeah, there's like physically I'm doing this, and that's different from like a memory. Also,
which is nowhere nearby.
Also, where your hands are and when they control your motor movement, it's all in one place. It's like here. Mm-hmm. Whereas memories are scattered throughout the entire brain. So it's not one place that does one kind of memory, or all memories are in one place. It's everywhere.
That's amazing.
And that makes it very difficult to study.
It sounds very difficult, yeah. So like my hand movement, me remembering how something feels, would that be in the hand area of the brain?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So
that part of memory. So memory is kind of, if I'm talking about a sensation, the motor part of the brain and where you feel sensations are next to each other, and the part of the brain that would process the memory of a sensation would be near the sensation area.
I hope so.
But let's say if I have to remember what this book looks like when I leave, that's going to be my memory of where my vision is. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's everywhere.
So if I'm remembering how hot the fire was, that's like 6 different places at the same time, like being activated. Because I'm using my sense, I'm remembering that I like reached my hand over to it. I remember that I burned my hand, so it hurt. So there's pain.
You're using all of your brain constantly, different regions, because everything is so small. For example, I'm touching. In order for me to touch this, do this. Yeah. Well, I gotta relax some of my muscles and fire others, but I also have to be sure that I'm doing that in a way that I don't pull a muscle. So there's a part of my brain, the cerebellum, that's error correction. So for example, if I do this, your brain's like, well, I didn't get the cup. Well, I gotta do another loop of the same firing. I gotta do this again, but I gotta fix the error. It'll go to my cerebellum, fix my error, and say, hey, you need to go to the right a few inches. Yeah. And that's what it does. So it's a bunch of different regions activating at the same time. Also, there's a specific part of my brain that does proprioception, which is your posture. So in order for me to get this glass, I need to know where my body is in space. Oh my God. These are all very specific things that you don't think about that you do. Yeah. And that's why whenever you look at someone who, there's so many conditions that are very specific and odd. For example, people have had a stroke and they're not able to see this part of the world. Yeah. But if you were to throw a ball at them, they would be able to catch it even though they can't see it. What? So exactly, because the part of the brain that does reflexive movement is different than like the visual movement. It's exactly.
Your brain's amazing. So what I just learned is that my brain has a cerebellum, which is another brain within the brain that controls the brain.
It's called the hindbrain. So it's kind of a little bit behind. It's a teeny part at the back that people usually don't know exists. But yeah, it does pretty much of the primitive stuff. That it's like your posture, your body movement, reflexes, things like that are very basic. But yeah.
You're blowing my brain, like it's exploding. It's gone.
Exactly.
I think I gotta join your. Yeah. I think I gotta join your lab. You know, listen to more speeches. Definitely talk to you more often.
Our lab has some very cool stuff. In fact, our advisor was the first person to wake up people from a coma, which was incredibly groundbreaking. And he was able to wake up 2 people from a coma, 1 person in their 20s.
Like at will?
Mhm.
Like at will? Like he was just like, you're not going to be in a coma anymore, and
Well, he used a ultrasound machine, which is typically used for example. People remember it whenever they look for pregnancy to look at the baby. They curved the ultrasound device, that part that attaches to the skin, and that caused it to make the rays collide and have a very focused impact at that point where I'm trying to cause a stimulation. And that is called a high focus ultrasound stimulation.
Also, like when you use a microscope at the sun and it like lights a fire.
Yeah, kind of. But the reason why that worked is because he had to target the part of the brain that he thought was for consciousness, so making you aware and like wake up. But he also, that part of the brain is very deep in your brain. So 3 dimensions, like right in the center. And in order for that to work, he has to somehow not surgically hit anything else, but only hit that little teeny part in the brain that's in the center. And so he did that with the ultrasound because the arrays go through the brain tissue without affecting it at all, but only hit that little teeny part in the center.
The focus point.
The focus, the focus ultrasound point, exactly.
So he's Superman.
He's incredible. And that was able to wake up 2 of the patients, and through multiple stimulations, so let's say once a day or so, whenever kind of like a therapy, they're able to get better and better. And that was kind of groundbreaking as is. Right now, we're trying to work out how that's working. So the current study that we're on is trying to see, can we calculate the percentage of how conscious is someone who's in a coma? Because
are they ready to wake up?
How awake are they? Sometimes people are in a coma and they can't hear anything. They can't see anything. So they're in a vegetative state. But sometimes people are in a coma, but they can hear everything, they can remember everything, they can think, but they just can't wake up and interact.
Oh.
So we want to know which one is it. Is there a way to know? And so that's the idea, because right now, I believe 80% of the people who die from a coma are not because they die from the injuries that they have obtained. They die because they've just been unplugged from the care. Because physicians have said, there's no more hope. They're just going to be in a coma for 10 years. So let's just unplug, and then they just die from that.
So we could have saved all those people.
We might have a chance. And the idea is, if we are able to calculate a percentage of how awake someone is in a coma, then maybe I can help those people who are, let's say, 50% awake. And then I could do some sort of therapy, like that stimulation. And then from that, they'll wake up. So it's kind of like giving a chance and giving a new procedure path. And then maybe we can help more people.
That's like the coolest thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
He's a genius. And I recommend everybody to look at his work and our lab and my work.
Definitely check out her work and the lab's work. I don't know if this is like possible, but we'll see if we can get Dr. Monty on here, you know, get the MontiLab crew. Yeah, that's very inspiring work. Speaking of inspiration, I'm sure your story and your kind of path is going to be inspiring for a lot of people. If I was, let's say, like I'm a 17-year-old boy, I'm in 11th grade, I'm looking at this episode, I'm like, wow, neuroscience is the coolest thing I've ever heard of, or cognitive? Is that
Cognitive neuroscience.
Cognitive neuroscience. What was your bachelor? Cognition?
Cognitive science.
Cognitive science.
All of the sciences of cognition, and cognitive neuroscience is a specific type of cognitive science.
So I'm super interested in cognitive science, and specifically this cognitive neuroscience thing is the greatest thing I've ever heard. How would I get to where you are today?
Well, I'm currently a PhD student, so I'm almost where I want to be. But I would recommend people to do a lot of research, get some experience. So let's say you get into a lab and then you see what it's like to be in a lab.
But I'm in 11th grade, how am I going to get into a lab?
Well, I, in high school, worked at USC in a lab, and it was autism research, and it was again studying cognition. And that made me really interested, and I literally just did that by going online, signing up to a bunch of listservs, and then I got a bunch of emails about what those people were doing. And then one time I saw they were doing an event. It was for master's programs, but I was in 11th grade or something. And I just said, okay, why not? I'll sign up. I was the only high schooler. And because of that, I caught the attention of the people. They're like, you look very young. Why are you here? And I said, well, I'm very interested. I did some research about this. I want to work with you guys. And they gave me a volunteer position and they taught me all these
That's
things.
amazing.
So, yeah, just putting yourself out there. And then going to a bachelor's degree. First, I recommend cognitive science, of course, because you get to learn a bunch of different fields at the same time, rather than being like, you know, I'm just going to do
I'm 100% in right away.
this one specific thing, and then, you know, if you don't do that, you're kind of like, well, I don't know anything else. I don't know what else to do. So it's kind of like a safety net. And then afterwards, people typically, after a bachelor's, do 2 to 3 years of a gap year. I didn't do a gap year. I just immediately started my PhD program, which was also a joint master's and PhD. And I just started to work on both at the same time. And within 1 to 2 years, you'll get a master's degree. And then you start working on research, and you'll think of something that you want to be an expert at. For me, it was traumatic brain injuries. And then when you get your PhD, for a top scientist position, you typically have to do a postdoc, which is kind of like a fellowship into becoming a leading neuroscientist or a scientist. And you become, or my goal is to become a leading neuroscientist as a principal investigator. And have
Just
my
like
own
Dr.
lab.
Monty. Okay.
And have my own lab at either a hospital or a university or,
That sounds amazing. So can I call you Master Sonya? Is that the step until you become Dr. Sonya?
Yeah.
I mean Dr. Ashikyan?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, cool. Well, Master Ashikyan, Dr. Ashikyan, soon to be. It was a very great pleasure of mine talking to you and having you over here at our Keep It Simple podcast.
I try to keep it simple. I feel like it wasn't as simple as I wanted it to be.
I mean, it's hard
It's
to make
never
that
gonna be
simple.
simple.
Yeah,
It's never gonna be simple.
This is a crazy topic to be trying to simplify, but I feel like you did a fantastic job, and I'd love to see you again in the future, see what kind of paths your research are taking. And we have a few interesting topics coming up that are a little bit away from artificial intelligence, but I feel like the neuroscience experience that you have in cognition and everything will still play a big role, and I'd love to hear your opinions in the future.
I'd love to be back, and thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure, yeah. Thanks for watching. It's wonderful to have people like you watching the podcast. Please let me know who else you'd like to see on the podcast. I heard Elon Musk in the comments of the last video. I reached out to him on Twitter. I don't think he's gonna say yes, but I did my best, guys. So we'll see. Yeah, thanks for watching. Subscribe, and see you next week.